Hello, everybody, wherever you are. This is Francesco Verso from FutureCon. Actually, I am in Italy, in Rome, and I'm here to introduce the next panel, which is Anthropocene and Capitalocene. And I'm here with some very, very interesting authors, and it's my pleasure and honor to introduce them to you. So we have Stanley Robinson, is an American science fiction writer. Is the author of more than 20 books, including the international best-selling Mars trilogy, and more recently, Red Moon, New York, 2140, Aurora, Shaman, Green Earth, and 2312. He was sent to the Antarctic by the U.S. National Science Foundation's Antarctic Artists and Writers Program in 1995, and returned in their Antarctic Media Program in 2016. In 2008, he was named a Hero of the Environment by the Time magazine. He works with the Sierra Nevada Research Institute, the Clarion Writers Workshop, and UC San Diego's Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. His work has been translated into 25 languages and won a dozen awards in 5 countries, including the Hugo, Nebula, Locus, and World Fantasy Awards. In 2016, Asteroid 27243 was named Kim Robinson. Well, that's a big achievement. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Great. And then we have VanderMeer. She is award-winning editor and anthologist. She currently serves as acquiring editor for tar.com and Weird Fiction Review, and is the editor-in-residence of Shared Worlds, a science fiction and fantasy writing camp for high school students. The latest anthologies include The Time Traveler's Almanac, Sisters of the Revolution, The Big Book of Science Fiction, and The Big Book of Classic Fantasy, and The Big Book of Modern Fantasy. She can be found on Twitter at @VanderMeer.
Hey, everybody.
Please. Yeah. And then we have Ian McDonald. Is mostly science fiction writer living in Northern Ireland, just outside Belfast. A Hugo winner, has been nominated for almost all major science fiction and fantasy awards. His first novel, Desperation Road, was published to acclaim in 1988. Oh man, so long ago. His most recent is Luna, Moon Rising, the conclusion of the Luna trilogy. So welcome here, really a pleasure to meet you all.
Thank you.
So, mala tempora currunt, sed peiora parantur. We live in bad times, but the worst is yet to come. This ancient Latin complaint fully describes the spirit of our times and some of the past. And yet we are here, trying to cope with new challenges, fighting surveillance capitalism, climate change, and political dystopias. So my first question is, the coronavirus showed us that the economic crisis could be a minor issue. In other terms, Anthropocene could be much worse than Capitalocene, but the global conversation is stuck on how we go back to the previous normal, when that normal is exactly the reason of our current problems. Can science fiction show us an exit strategy, at least on planet Earth, or are we forced to leave the planet, like Elon Musk would like us to do, as the ultimate solution? So I would like to ask that first to Stanley Robinson.
Well, thank you, Francesco. I just will say there is no planet B. This is the bumper sticker, the slogan that puts it in a nutshell. I can claim, and I think along with Ian, to be one of the chief living Martians on the planet today. And so I have some standing to say it's not a viable solution to our problems here on Earth. That it will function like Antarctica. It'll be scientific bases at the very most, and it's not capable of supporting human existence independent of earthly support. So it'd be a better plan to move all of humanity to Antarctica, but nobody suggests that because the impossibility is evident, but it's 100 times more impossible on Mars. So it's a fantasy escape, and it needs to be said, maybe by science fiction writers most of all, that space science is an earth science, and it's beautiful and useful, but it's not a replacement for the only planet that we can live on, and we got to solve our problems here. That would be my position on it.
Yeah, right. And Anne, you have
I found that quote that you gave to be very, very interesting, because even though that quote is from a long time ago, I still see human nature, people being that way. I mean, we love to complain about the way things are. And I feel like in some ways, a lot of the advancements that we made have been because of divine discontent, so to speak. So we're always looking for ways to improve and to make the world a better place. But yet there are going to be those that think we need to go back in time to a different time when things were better, simpler. And I'm putting that in air quotes because it wasn't better and simpler for everyone. But I do feel very hopeful that we can, through science and science fiction, find ways to improve. But I also feel that it's important that we listen to each other and learn from each other, because there isn't just one way. When I was thinking about this panel before we started, it reminded me of a nonfiction book, if you don't mind me mentioning this nonfiction book. I met the writer a couple of years ago in New York at a conference, and his name is, and I'm going to get it wrong, so let me try. His name is Gleb Regorodevsky, and he is a writer who wrote a book called The Archipelago of Hope. And it's a nonfiction book where he traveled around the world and met with different indigenous groups of people to learn about how they are dealing with climate change, because these are people that are very close to the land that they're living on, and they live off of it. And so he was studying them and working with them to learn, how do we approach, because these people have to adjust and make changes. And he was very inspired by many of the things that they were doing to be able to survive and to be able to continue improving and progressing. And so when I see something like that in a what's happening in the real world, I know that science fiction can also extrapolate from that, because it's all coming from our imaginations anyway.
Thank you. Thank you. Ian?
Yeah. In general, I think a rule in life I try to live by is that if Elon Musk has an idea, don't do it. It's certainly a bad idea. He's got some nice rockets and a couple of fancy cars for very rich people, but the whole thing of putting chips in people's brain, no. If Elon Musk says it, don't do it. If he thinks we can somehow abandon the planet, and go to Mars and do something magical on Mars, it's almost certainly a bad idea. Elton John said, "Mars ain't no place to raise your kids," and Elton John is far wiser. Actually, the work in progress I'm doing, but I've just finished. One of the characters has on her wall, or off his wall, a big sign in giant 200-point Garamond that says, don't be like Elon. And I think the thing is that we're relying on medieval concepts of leadership. That somehow we've gone back to of a great leader. The great leader, always a man, will lead us out into the up onto the green slopes of a future utopia, out from our hell or whatever happens. But our world is too complex for these medieval notions to apply anymore. Our world is too complex for CEOs to run it. A corporation is a simplistic thing compared to a nation state. Corporations don't have nuclear weapons yet. They don't have foreign policies yet. And the ideas that come from, and they almost always come from corporate culture, from capitalism, that somehow that kind of CEO thinking will lead us into a brighter future. No, our world is far too complex for that. One person doesn't have the answers, and one person doesn't have leadership. And we need, I say it again and again and again, and I'll never stop saying it, is only connect. It is the connections between us, connections between institutions, between peoples, between nations, between organizations and ways of thinking that will give us a plan towards the future. And we'll kind of do it piecemeal, bit by bit. There is no grand vision, I think.
So you think that the CEOs are, in a way, fulfilling the vacancy of the political power, or we let them?
Yeah, exactly. And they're flashy, and they have nice toys, And it's like, I mean, would you put a James Bond villain in charge of your counter future policy? I think not. But it's the same sort of way. There's a surprising amount of psychopathy sociopathy in the psychological profiles of a lot of CEOs, and this surely is no way to plan for the future of 7 billion human beings.
All right. Moving to the next question. In your books, you show the readers many futures and worlds where technology and social issues are often related. Natural environments, cultural values, technological innovations, and biopolitics are powerful tools that shape any landscape. In your opinion, is this old world really dying while a new one struggles to be born? Can you make an example of resilience or anti-fragility, namely situations that gain and improve from disorder and negative forces, taken from your stories or the book that you have edited? So, Stanley, up to you.
Well, it seems to me from the historical record that times of chaos and disorder are frequent and maybe more common than times of stability and peace. So things do progress even in these times, but I don't like, following up on something that Ian said, that this corporate culture of disruption, of breaking things to make things better is a ploy, I think, for market share and not for actual progress, and that really stability is better. And there's the philosophical concept of scaffolding, that each generation builds a scaffold, and it's sort of like coral reefs, a certain amount of achievement that is a broad cultural thing that takes everybody. And then that the next generation is able to stand on the shoulders of the generation before on the next higher scaffold. So every once in a while, there will be a catastrophe, a revolution, wars that will break down some scaffolds, or in some ways, certain things will accelerate, but often it's mostly weapons. But medicine is a weapon when you're in a war. So these periods of acceleration do happen, but I'm a believer in the scaffolding theory that we need the stability to build on the work of the past. And that's really what the scientific method is all about too, building on previous work. So I would plump for stability and peace. I hope it seems a little self-evident to say so, but that's how I feel about it.
And do you have any example, maybe from your stories, that you can talk about, or maybe later?
Well, geez, think about, well, in the Mars trilogy, they had to write a constitution to put together the desires of a very disparate group of people, essentially an international group from Earth, so that there needed to be something like a world government that had its rule of law, and after that they were able to flourish near the end of that long novel. I keep coming back to that. In a book of mine called Aurora, the attempt to leave this planet is shown to be impossible, and so my star travelers actually returned to Earth to great scorn and derision in order to start rebuilding the beaches that have gone underwater. So I think all of these are have that underlying assumption in them. I don't think chaos is good for us.
Okay, thank you. Anne?
Well, I think that in order for people to be willing to change, they have to be uncomfortable enough with the way things are right now to want to make the change. So people are going to just maintain the status quo until the point where maintaining the status quo is no longer tenable and they're forced to make a change. I see that often, not just in larger scales, but also in very small things. Like, for example, somebody who is in a very bad relationship, but they stay in it and they stay in it. So it really is kind of the same thing. But yet I am still very hopeful in those things that bother us in the back of our head, where we get these ideas that come, well, how do I change this, or how do I make this better, or how do I get this little thing that's niggling at me in the back of my head to go away? And I was very fortunate last year to start working with the X Prize Foundation. It's a global international foundation that brings together scientists and innovative thinkers from all around and work on different projects. And the project that I work on, of course, is fiction. And the anthology that I did last year was an anthology called Current Oceans. And what it did is it allowed science fiction writers to reimagine the future, different ways in which we can help better and improve what's happening in the oceans. And some of the stories that I published were absolutely fantastic, but I can also see, and I've seen this in the past with the space industry, that a lot of times science fiction stories can help inform and inspire the actual science that's happening. So I was very fortunate to work with the X Prize Foundation. I do know that, yes, there are all these problems, and we can get ground down and depressed and made to feel like we can't do anything. And that way doesn't really help us. So I do like the optimistic view of if we all work together, if we listen to different ideas from around the world, that's going to help us get through this. And at the very least, it's going to help us come together and feel like we're not so alone. So in that sense, my husband always says I'm such a Pollyanna and I'm always seeing the glass half full. But I do think that those kinds of things that feel like they could destroy us because they can make us so sad and depressed can also inspire us and invigorate us to reach out to other people and see what we can do to affect those positive changes. And I definitely see myself oftentimes turning to fiction and turning to fiction writers and their storytelling to help me get through these bad times. And that's been very beneficial. So working on Current Oceans last year was fantastic for me because I got to see these viewpoints from all of these amazing writers from around the world as they were tackling with this in a fictional way, but still, these things could be possible.
Well, let me tell you that you did an amazing job. I read the anthology and I am going to publish it in Italian in 2 months. So I bought the rights.
Wonderful. That's fantastic.
It's a fantastic anthology. The stories are really, really, really top class. Thank you very much. Ian, you.
Yeah, I think we've kind of hit a point in our history where the old settlement, the 20th century political and social and economic settlement isn't working anymore. Capitalism isn't delivering what it promised. Its system is broken. We have market failure all over the place. Our political system is kind of tied so obviously to the electoral cycle as well, that it's kind of weak and can't think long term. I think worldwide, in everywhere, there is a need for change, for some new ideas, but we don't have any great new ideas. We are right, like Britain was in the 1980s. We are ripe for a revolution. The problem is that the revolution we're getting is coming from the right, not from the left. Back in the 80s, the revolution came from Margaret Thatcher and the Tory party, and the ripples of that still inform politics in this country. So we want something, but we just aren't getting any new coherent ideas. It's always easy to blame social media, and I do blame social media a lot because a lot of it is, almost all of it is deeply toxic. Because it's an amplifier, and that makes any good idea difficult to get through if any idea can be amplified, then the bad ones as well as the good ones can be amplified as well. And I think we need something that's deeper and kind of longer term than that, to kind of engage. But we are such short-term creatures. I'm kind of rambling a bit here. I mean, I've been a member. I've talked about this in the past. I've been a member of the Long Now Foundation for quite a while. I think I'm due I think I'm due to renew my sub fairly soon. But there are several groups involved in long-term thinking rather than short-term thinking. Short-termism has got a bit of this problem, and if we can't think long-term, then we are in big trouble. But it's the hardest thing to do when the new, the immediate, the sensational, anything with a narrative to it will grab our attention and divert us away from thinking long-term. What to do with it? I don't know. I think it needs to start with a deep level of education globally. I think we need to be able to taught how to think and how to discriminate. I'm always asked about parties. Well, when we had parties, what is it you do? I'm a writer. And what's that good for? Well, I write books. The one skill that writers have is that we can spot a narrative from a mile off, and we know that narratives aren't true. We make up narratives, we impose narratives on lives. People's lives have no narratives. Our lives have no plots. There aren't any great plots or overriding missions or conspiracies. Life just happens and things happen. And anything that looks like a plot or a narrative or a story, a writer could tell you that's probably made up by somebody. That's kind of our one gift. Maybe we need new and better narratives since we're so kind of addicted to them. Maybe that's something we could do if enough people read science fiction, or if we had enough of a vision to change people's lives. That would be a great thing.
Yeah, talking about long-term thinking, I would like to report a quote by Ian Watson. He said that the Chinese government is in a good position because they are the only one that can think in long term. They know they will be there in 20 or 30 years, while our politics in the West are just, concerned with the next election in 6 months or 1 year, so they cannot plan anything. So this is good and bad as it might seem, but it's very striking, I think, from Ian Watson. Really, really good. Let me ask another question. Is technology, as we know it, opening up new solutions, or are we just changing the name of our troubles and anxieties? In other terms, are we too close to dystopia, or do we still have room for utopia? Stan?
Well, let's start with this word technology. We are a technological species. We evolved by the use of tools, and we were using tools even before we were human, so we've co-evolved with them. So there's no cause, there's no justification for any rejection of technology as such. It's what we are. But I always try to expand the definition of technologies, and here it can use computers as an analogy. The division between hardware and software, they are both technologies. And so if you acknowledge that computer software is a technology, and without it, the hardware doesn't even run, there you get the better definition of technologies. It includes systems. And at that point, language is a technology. The rule of law is a technology, which means that justice itself is a technology. And in that larger definition, I would say we're just focusing on the wrong technologies, on the hardware, on the flashy stuff, the toys, the stuff that capitalism invents in order to push the short-term buttons in our head for a dopamine response. Over the long term, the technologies are different and are systems based in nature. And I come to capitalism, since this panel's about that. That is a technology that, as Ian pointed out, is dysfunctional. It creates injustice, inequality and biosphere destruction by its rules. I mean, running correctly by its rules, it has these bad results. It has to change. So the crucial technology is political economy. And I say this rather than saying economics, because economics is just the analysis of capitalism. It's nearly useless. At least it's a captured social science. But political economy is the combination of the two, and the acknowledgement that we make up our economic systems from scratch as a kind of an improvisation, historical improvisation. They're not well designed, they're kludges, and especially the one we're living in now, neoliberal capitalism, late capitalism, Thatcher Reagan capitalism that has been in charge for 40 years has been incredibly destructive. So we do need to focus on the technology of a new political economy, some kind of post-capitalism. There's many parts of it that exist in socialism that are as obvious as the day. You don't have to name it that. There might be other factors going on. So I always refer to it as post-capitalism to leave it a kind of a bit of a blank slate to fill in as needed by figuring things out as we go.
All right, thank you, very good. Anne?
Well, I think that if we're going to be talking about technology in a political kind of structure, I feel like it's going to be more important for people when it touches them personally. And you've heard the saying before, all politics are local. So I see so many people thinking about the future and that their vote doesn't matter or it doesn't make a difference because they're looking at the world around them very small and what's right in front of them. And one of the things that has become very important to me is to become more involved in the things in my backyard locally, because I think that if everybody does that, it's going to expand. Now, as far as technology in the future, there's always going to be a place for that. And I think the reason for that is, as a species, human beings are just curious. We are just curious, and we always want to try and find things out, and we want to figure things out and see what we can do. And that's how we have ended up where we are here, is through seeing something, wanting to make it better, and trying to make those changes somehow, whether it be on a very small range, like how do I better water my garden, or something on a more global aspect, how do I ensure that there's clean water for everyone. But when I was working on the X Prize anthologies, one of the anthologies that I did this year that came out in March was called Avatars, Inc. And of course, at the time that we were working on it, all of those stories were written last year before there was any idea of a pandemic or any of that kind of stuff. But when Avatars, Inc. came out and these writers were writing stories about how we can use the avatar technology in the future, it came at the most perfect time for people, because people were having to be separated from their loved ones because of contamination and because of the virus, and being able to use an avatar to be with the people that you love anywhere in the world, that whole idea just appealed to so many people. And what I found very interesting about Avatars, Inc., more so than any other anthology that I've ever worked on, is that this particular anthology came at such a time that I was getting requests from all over the country, mainstream drive-in, drive time radio shows, things like that, where they wanted to talk about the avatar technology. And these aren't people that read science fiction. I'm telling you right now, these are not people that read science fiction. These are soccer moms and, other kinds of people, but they were just very intrigued about this whole idea, because at the time we were all on lockdown, and the idea of having an avatar to be able to connect with other people really appealed to them. So I feel like there's always going to be that curiosity, because people that were asking me questions, people that don't know anything about the history of science fiction or any other stories, they were very intrigued about this whole concept, and it made them think about these ideas in a way that they hadn't thought of before. So I do think that you can get ideas from anywhere and not just from the scientists.
Okay, thank you very much. Ian?
Yeah, I think automation. I mean, we're talking about technology. That's the next big thing coming down the line is mass automation, and I think it's far too powerful and probably far too socially destructive a technology to be allowed for capitalism to be allowed to use it without any constraints, checks, or balances on it at all. I'm reminded of a book some of you might have heard of by a guy called, I don't know his name up here, Four Futures by a writer called Peter Fraze. Came out a couple of years back. Yeah, and for those who haven't read it, he looks at possible ways that kind of our current neoliberal capitalism can evolve or de-evolve. And he puts it along two axes. Well, look at that, axes, yes. There is the vertical axis is between abundance and scarcity. The horizontal axis being coercion and freedom. And inside each of these, it puts four possible futures. Automation is absolutely at the heart of this. The high abundance, low coercion model is which is the thing I used in Luna. It's the Sun family's great vision for proper communism, where everyone has whatever they want in a society of high energy abundance. The flip side of that is low abundance, high coercion. Actually, I'll come to that one last. That's the scary one. Okay. There is, you've read this book. There is high abundance. There is high abundance and kind of high abundance and high coercion, which he calls rentierism, where a few people control all the access to technologies to the ones. It's like John Deere tractors at the moment, where there are hacking classes of farmers hacking John Deere tractors, because you only since rent the tractor, you have to pay a license every year to get the software to run your tractor. So the hardware doesn't matter, it's renting the software is where the money's made. And one possible future is where a small group of people basically rent everything out to you. You don't own the music you think you own, you don't own the books you think you own, you don't own anything. You're paying rent, and as soon as you stop paying, you lose that. Another one is high coercion and what have I gone through? High coercion, high abundance. No, I've done that one. Anyway, one is yes, one is freedom and scarcity, which he thinks leads to a socialist future, and the last one is high coercion and scarcity, which basically which he calls exterminism, which is that wealth eventually will circle the wagons, call in the guards, and basically defend itself against anything that may attack wealth. And this book came out 4 years ago, and I kind of think we're seeing that in that the political systems we're getting now, all the revolutions are rich people defending riches. Rich white men will do anything to defend their wealth. Having said that, I read a great story in the paper this week. Can't remember his name. He's still alive. He's a billionaire, an Irish-American billionaire from County Fermanagh in Northern Ireland originally. He made $8 billion on duty-free shops, a chain of duty-free shops, and he decided he would give it all away while he was alive. And I think he's 83 now, or 89 or whatever. He's in his 80s now, and apparently the last dollar from his foundation went this week. I mean, he's basically given everything he ever made away. Because the point is, what is the point of wealth if you don't do something with it? What is Jeff Bezos doing with all that money? What is Elon Musk doing with all that money? You're setting up your flashy rockets and you've got your yachts, but that's still loose change to people like that. It can make major, it can change whole societies. The problem is with philanthropy is that I always feel that it shouldn't be about the goodwill or bad will of the person giving it. Tax is a much fairer way to distribute it. It doesn't involve someone's sense of charity. Automation, I think, of course it's going to come. I think automation needs to be licensed. like cars, like any other technology, and licensed very, very heavily. So if employment is affected, which it will be, we have a universal basic income basically funded by automation licensing. Get it?
All right. All right.
Better.
Thank you. Next question is, as a science fiction writer or editor, can future literacy play a role to shape new awareness? Which tools would be useful for a new generation of decision makers or artists? Stanley?
Well, the future can't be predicted, so it's a matter of modeling. The educational tools of scenario building and modeling, as done by ecologists, would be useful for everybody. We have the standard science fiction device of extrapolation, which if you use one of these XY graphs, you take the trajectory that has been demonstrated in something, a technology or a social movement over the last certain period of time, a year, 50 years, and then you project that forward on the trajectory that it's going. Straight line extrapolation, it's been called in science fiction in America since the 1950s. And nothing in nature or in history behaves by way of straight line extrapolation. So then you get the curves on the graph that are increasing returns, where things begin to shoot up in an inexorable way. You get decreasing returns, where things begin to slow down because of the limits of resources or of the laws of physics. And then you get the S curve, the logistical curve, where things rise for a time until they hit their limits, and then they slow down, and you get that big S on the graph. And almost everything behaves by way of a logistical curve, but you can't predict in advance the curvatures. So, but even knowing these terms, even beginning to play the game of thinking in terms of accelerating or decelerating changes, would be an aid to thought over long term. And then in terms of the what you might call the motivation for thinking long term, I think you have to do something like India, where you have the concept of the 7 generations, that you're the 7 generations behind you have formed you. You're responsible to the 7 generations to come, and that's a kind of long-term thinking that is not foreign to human beings. We have all kinds of long-term processes going on, and people do care about their descendants. So I think the motivation is there. The tools are somewhat lacking, and of course the political mechanism it's maybe the government itself that is long-term thinking, as opposed to, say, business. So again, as always, I would privilege government over business. I'm an anti-capitalist and a pro-socialist, and so this is the definition of that is to support science and government over business and exploitation. And the two are always in combination, but you can have preferences as to which you prefer. So we do have long-term thinking, and we always have. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to plan or to have achieved what we have as a society. And that gets downplayed, or everybody talks about, well, that there's nothing but short-term thinking, and everybody is impulsive, etc. But this is to ignore the constant long-term thinking that is maybe so inherent that we don't even notice that it's happening. So yeah, a little more awareness and education. And of course, science fiction helps with this. The field of science fiction is a way of playing these games, and a way of testing, of modeling, of running scenarios, of thinking, well, if A happens, then B will occur. And then someone else will say, no, 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 if A happens, then C will occur. And the stories are there to provide what you might call plausibility by way of a thick texture. You live it. You don't just suggest it in a sentence. You actually go through it by way of time travel and telepathy, which is what fiction is. And you live that out and see how plausible it feels to you, given the way your life is. So science fiction is a stupendously good tool for long-term thinking. And people who like science fiction are generally better at long-term thinking for that very mental exercise that they do for their recreation. And that's what it's for. And I'm saying this because it's a game and it's for fun, it's entertainment, it's art. But it was Brecht who was always telling us that art and education are a false dichotomy, that art needs to be educational and that education needs to be artful and fun. And the two aren't very different from each other. So polemical art, didactic art, these are redundant adjectives. And so I'd say, I mean, I'm a patriot of the science fiction field, and it's why I practice it, but not, I mean, actually, it's not why I practice it. I practice it because it's what happens to me. In other words, I don't really choose the art form that I'm engaged in. It shows me, but I think there are good reasons for it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. Anne?
Well, if we're going to talk about the future, you can't really talk about the future without thinking about future generations and how you can contribute to their knowledge and experience. And so I've been a lifelong educator. I've worked in education with from little kids all the way up to adults as old as can be. And I come from a family of educators. So I feel that education is an extremely important first step in how you affect the future generations. And I've been thinking a lot about that, especially now because we're going through an education crisis at the moment. I have several family members that are teachers and from second grade on to high school, worried about how they're going to be able to deal with classrooms. And then my grandchildren in Los Angeles are doing everything online. And then I worry about, well, what kind of an education are they getting online? And so I have been thinking a lot about, well, how do we provide our children with the best possible foundation for them to be able to take care of what happens to them in the future? And I feel like traditional education is one thing, but the way that those children are going to get the best education is through experience, more of a experiential types of happenings in education. And it's not just what you get in a classroom, whether it's an online or a physical classroom, but I think that you can learn from doing other things. To me, it's very important, if it's at all possible with your young children, to travel with them. I think it's very important for the younger that you can to have children experience what it's like to be in a different place, to travel around, because that's only going to inform them and expand their horizons. But I also feel like it's very important for the younger generations to have an understanding of the wider world around them and also of the natural world. I think it's very important that kids have a firm and strong understanding of the natural world and nature around us, animals and plants, because if they have an understanding, then they will learn to love it. And if they have a love for it, then they will protect it. And I feel that that's true of anything. What you understand, you can come to love, and what you love, you're going to protect. So in order for us to protect the world that we have and the natural world, I'm talking about outside, we need our children to be able to have those experiences being outside and not just locked in a room looking at a screen. And so I know that a lot of educational opportunities have given children those abilities to be able to be one with nature, be outside, camping trips, summer camps, things like that. So when you have an opportunity for the kids to go out and be in nature and relate to the natural world, it's going to open up so many things for them. And it also will allow them to share those experiences with other people that they meet. So I definitely think travel if possible. And if you can't do travel, I understand that it can be, especially now, but it can be cost prohibitive to travel with your children. But there's a lot of things that you can do with younger generations. And one of them is by reading fiction from other countries, because that's a way, seriously, that is a way for people to experience what it's like to live in another world, because this is what happens when you read a story. Stan says something about fiction is time travel. Exactly. Because when you get immersed in a story, you are seeing the eyes through the characters in those stories, and you're living their lives with them. And what better way to be able to travel around the world cheaply, right? But still in such a beautiful way to connect. And to me, the more experiences and the more points of view that children can be exposed to, and also other people as well, older people as well, I think that's only going to be a benefit for what you're going to be able to imagine and ponder and plan for in the future. So that's what I would say is expand your horizons by thinking globally, but also think locally as well, because that's your first connection to the people around you and to nature.
So shall we do science fiction mandatory in school?
Well, I'll tell you what's really interesting is that I have been fortunate where a lot of my anthologies have been taught in high schools and colleges. And anytime a teacher asks me if I will do an online presentation, Q&A with their classes, I always say yes, because I do love to hear what those kids have to say. And a lot of times I'm working in like high school classes where they're assigned to read the book, and they're like, they're groaning, oh, I have to read these books. But it's interesting how they get very excited about certain stories. And because the anthologies that I do are so massive, it's very easy for a teacher to pick a couple of stories, but then the kids get excited about what they just read, and that might lead them to read something else, and then maybe read something else. So anytime I have an opportunity to speak to a class, I'm going to be there. I will do it.
Cool. Okay, thank you very much. Ian.
Yeah, just picking up. This great thing about going third, you just pick up on what everyone else has said, so I need no original thoughts or material here. Yeah, it's like Stan was saying. It's like stories are telepathy, but the fiction is also empathy, in that it asks the central question: what is it like to be? And that's what fiction is very good at. What is it like to be, a teenager growing up on the move? What is that like to be? What is it like to be, a priest in a Jesuit priest in 18th century Brazil? What is it like to be that? And it's getting that ability to just step outside yourself, just even for a few moments. It's kind of the beginning of real education. School. The greatest thing I ever learned was for our GCSE history. We did world history. Now, because I'm old, I did my GCSE history in 1976. The last bit of world history we covered in 1976 was the fall of Saigon in 1975. And we did we did Turkish history, Malaysian history, Japanese history, US history, South American history, Chinese history, the history of the independent movements in Africa, the whole lot. The history of Israel, Palestine, Italy, Spain, you name it. We did the lot, not in great detail. But the thing was, we got a view of where the world we live in comes from. As I was saying earlier, it's only connect. You could see the connections between all the separate histories, because history is not a thing that occurs in silos. It all connects world, nation to nation, movement to movement, group to group. And for me, that was a revelation that's informed the way I write, because it's about for me, it's about the connections between things. It's the ability to put yourself into another life, another body, another culture, another society, another time, and then to see how that connects to your life and to the lives of countless other people all around the world. One of the Long Now Foundation's projects they're looking at is long institutions. which is an interesting idea, which is institutions that, the problem with, yet again, with capitalism is that the cycle of capitalism is deliberately short. It's the Hindu tree, Martha. It's creation, sustenance, destruction, and then the whole cycle starts again. But long institutions, maybe hundreds to thousands of years old. Now, I'm not totally up to date on this, but the one they kind of found at the moment that had a kind of real the only really long-term institution they found was the Catholic Church, which is a history of a couple of thousand years. And that's unusual for a religion. For an institution to endure, it has to be easy to join, hard to leave, and also be self-regulating. Protestantism and Islam tends to break up into sects all the time, and it's the eternal problem of you get no continuity because of sectarianism, but Catholicism endures a long time. And I think if we kind of need, I was thinking of other things like football clubs. There are some football clubs that go back to the 19th century, so they are, back 3 centuries. That's heading towards becoming a long-term institution, and it's like we're saying about, there are things that have been around a long time that have continuity and and are future facing, in that they're preparing for the future, that they have mechanisms for projecting themselves into the future, not changing that much, remaining stable, but still continuing and kind of doing what they're doing, and there's kind of a lot to be learned from that. In a sense, we live in kind of constant revolution, but we crave stability at the same time. It's one of these human problems, I think. I'm just going to throw a quick. I made a note on this at the start of this, and I've forgotten where it's come from. But I read a book by, I hope I pronounce her name right, Kate Raworth called "Donut Economics," which is a kind of yes, exactly. Yes, it comes from education, which is what Anne was talking about. And about systems thinking. It's about how things are linked together, like my 20th century history, that everything connects. And when you start thinking in terms of systems, you see how things cascade, connect, influence, feedback one another. The concept of donut economics is that economics is not an abstract entity that exists outside physical reality. Any economic transaction has a physical input, so therefore it is governed by the laws of thermodynamics. Inescapably, no argument whatsoever. It is governed by the rules of thermodynamics. And therefore it exists inside a physical structure beyond which an economic system can't trespass. I've been writing a bit about the insanity of Bitcoin, where in a sense the energy use becomes exponential. The entropy of the system of I've got the name of the expression that I use to calculate it, but the entropy, just ramps up, goes absolutely exponential fairly quickly, and the energy use becomes insane. It breaks, it makes economic sense, but it's existing inside a physical system. So that is the outside of the donut. Are the actual laws of thermodynamics and the physical systems of energy, input, output, heat, the whole thing. The inside of the donut, the hollow space at the center, is the social level below which we will not fall, which is, rising inequality, that exterminism I was talking about from the Four Futures, massive ecological destruction, biosphere degradation, that's the inside of the donut. And between that hollow inside and the outside, that's how human economic life should be structured, in that donut. That's where a sane economic system can take place. It very much, it's a couple of months since I read it, but donut economics is very much about systemic thinking, how everything connects in feedback loops. And that's me. I'm out of material.
Thank you. That was really interesting. So my last question before we open to the audience is, can a new genre in science fiction like Solarpunk with its accent on inclusivity, sustainability, biomimicry, community-based political involvement, replace the exclusivity, unsustainability, technological solutionism, and political disillusion of cyberpunk in terms of cultural impact and pervasiveness? Stan?
Yes, I think so. First, I want to register that if that were the goal of this movement, that the name is wrong, that using punk as a suffix for any new movement in science fiction, which has happened since cyberpunk, so we had steampunk, and now solarpunk. There's hope punk, if you can imagine, and someone has. But punk, when you think of the 70s rock music that punk comes from, was anarchic and simplistic and anti-social and anti-government. So cyberpunk, it fits perfectly. But for solarpunk to actually come into a reconciliation with this planet's biosphere, live within the donut, using Ian's writer's example, would take science and government and social cooperation. You can't go out onto the mean streets as a solo film noir star and change the world for the better. You find your corner in a dystopian world that will never improve. And that's the story of punk and of cyberpunk. So the name is stupid, and it's unfortunate because what it shows is that young writers in the science fiction community, there are so many of them, and Anne knows this better than anyone, that you have to somehow create market share. You have to raise your profile. And the first thought is to join a movement, to become part of a school. And for a writer, for a novelist, to become part of a school is already desperately wrong. And Ian and I think, will stand as examples of science fiction writers that have never been associated with any school, except as maybe a polemical attack back in the 80s. But by and large, it's best to be an independent artist to the point of not even knowing very well what the rest of the community is doing, so that you can afford to become eccentric and idiosyncratic without scaring yourself out of doing what you really want to do. So there's a double pressure on these young writers, and I feel sorry for them, but it's always been true. It was just as true back in the 80s when Ian and I started as it is now. You have to muscle your way into people's attention, and joining a school looks like it might work, but it's a short-term strategy. Over the long term, you want to be your own brand and your own name. So back to solarpunk. They should be calling themselves utopian science fiction. They should be taking on the name utopia. And whether if there's negative ramifications to the word utopia, then they need to think again, or they need to seize it like gay people seize the word gay and turn it into a positive rather than a negative. Utopian thinking is the idea that there could be a better world by historical things that we do now. It's the name for a dynamic process of history. It's the name for progress in history and improvement. And it has a long tradition. It's a school, you might say. Utopian science fiction writers have always been rare on the ground, going back to Sir Thomas More and Plato. I mean, you can actually name on the fingers and toes of your hands all of the utopian prominent writers in the entire history of the genre, which is bizarre. So actually, these young writers have an opportunity there to say, well, we're utopian writers because the world needs to get better. So, okay, this is just to complain about their marketing choices. Their ultimate goal, what they're writing about, is beautiful and correct. And I'm in full support. I would consider myself, if I believed in schools, to be an ancestor, an eccentric uncle to the solarpunk movement. I love them dearly, and the individual writers are often supremely talented and writing the best stuff around. So my main complaint is mostly about marketing and how do you make your mark in this world of culture that we're in.
Yeah, I would like to comment because I also invested in and promote this movement. I totally agree with you that it might not be the best name at all, But I think that the punk here, it's connected to the fact that we live in a capitalistic society. So to be a punk today, it means to be inclusive, to be the exact opposite of what it was a punk individually driven person that doesn't care about the others, and the end is near and there's no future. So to be a punk today in a dystopic reality, it's to be the opposite of what the mainstream tells us to be. That is, we want to believe in a community. We want to take political decision. We don't want to be taken out of the conversation. That is the opposite. So to be a punk is always to be the opposite of what is currently the strong power advocates. What it tries to give us, what it tries to take away from us. So I interpret the term punk in relation to the times that we are living at the moment, but I totally agree with you that we might find a better name, and also it could be that the name wasn't given by any writer at all, because there is no leader or any kind of book or story that we refer to as the Solarpunk ultimate narrative. So maybe it came from a bookseller, or it came from a blogger, or it came from somebody that it's not even in the science fiction genre. Sometimes Solarpunk is connected to other kind of political resistance, or doing alternative kind of agriculture or sustainable resources and stuff like that. So we don't even know maybe where. I mean, we know where some definitions came from, but yeah, and it's really interesting that maybe we should have some kind of state of the art or symposium or kind of forum to rename or rebrand this thing. Thank you. That's really interesting.
Yeah, let me add.
Yeah, sure.
Let me add that what you say makes sense to me, but resistance to the current order, in the way punk was resisting British capitalism, Thatcher, and also progressive rock, which I much prefer to punk music myself personally. But if what you say is true, it should be called the Extinction Rebellion or Solidarity. There are political names for resistance that don't refer back to British garage band angry music of the late 1970s, because that's just an unfortunate historical association that words have stickiness and they have their histories embedded in them. Punk backwards in English would be KNUP, knup, nup. Should be, you could reverse the spelling to get a new word entirely. I don't really know, but I think it matters. And I think also the whole idea of a school is maybe an artistic error for the individual artists involved. So there are issues there that need to be considered.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to Ian because he was a punk, right?
I was.
So there you go.
You headbanger.
I was. Yeah. Yeah, it was great. Yes, I kind of I made a swift transition from kind of mid-70s prog to punk when I heard it on the radio on John Peel, and it was I forgot the name of the journalist. It sounded like the greatest thing you have ever heard, because it was a blast against the establishment, against everything that was kind of grey and dull, but particularly in Northern Ireland, it went beyond sectarianism. You were a punk first and foremost. That was what it did. Whether you were Catholic or you're Protestant or anything else for that matter, you were a punk first and foremost. And the music straddled the divide and became a unifying factor for a lot of young people of that generation. Who went to the clubs, who went to the bands, who didn't want anything to do with our established politics. So in some ways, though, punk is seen as being kind of nihilistic against everything. In Northern Ireland, yes, it was against something that was bad. It was positive as far as it went. It's only music. It isn't going to change the world. but it certainly gave birth to a generation who could see beyond our kind of small scale tribal politics. It had a very important role in our politics. And I think I'm still interested in the ethos because it's independent-minded. It asks questions. It makes its own noise. The closest thing I kind of got to the old punk ethos was the dance music, kind of early rave stuff in the late 80s, early 90s. Yet again, I had that kind of thing of kind of going and doing its own thing and moving away from society. But if it gets questions asked in the House of Commons and it makes the Daily Mail raise a polemic against, down with this sort of thing, careful now, what are your children doing? At some level, it's a good thing. If people pay attention, that's good. What happens after that is kind of up to you and up to them. I've never been totally happy with being in a movement. I kind of subscribe to the sayings of that great original punk William Blake, the words of loss. I must invent a system, boy, be enslaved by another man's. I shall not reason and compare. My business is to create. That's always been kind of my philosophy, that it's, I love the idea of, let's call it Solarpunk for want of a better word, of kind of utopian, optimistic storytelling. My problem is, I'm reminded of when I used to work in television, there was a producer of Channel 4, a guy called Stuart Cosgrove, and he used to we come with these wonderful ideas and they go, okay, this is eat your greens television, basically. And I kind of wonder that an awful lot of it can be kind of eat your greens fiction as well. It's kind of good for you. Here's what you should be doing, but it's no fun whatsoever. And the challenge is to make it exciting, have good characters. You don't have to save the universe. You don't have to have giant warfies blowing shit out of each other, but it needs to engage, needs to tell a story, needs to kind of, if it's going to preach, preach well, or preach with puppets, or preach doing magic. You do something to sell the idea. So I'm always a little bit wary of Eat Greens. Also, it strikes me. This is my last. Is at the moment, why space opera? Come on, guys. Plucky individual fights evil empire. Well, empires are evil. Who'd have thought? It seems to me a kind of retroactive step. We should be going to, I think fiction should be going to where you're advocating. Maybe we're just a little bit ahead of the curve. But yeah, it's making stories that people want to read. Yep, that's it. Yeah, other material.
Thank you. Anne?
Well, believe it or not, I used to be a punk rocker back in the day.
Okay.
But it meant something totally different in the environment that I was growing up in. And it was more of a push against album-oriented rock and musicians that knew how to play their instruments, where we were a bunch of musicians that were just figuring it out. And 2.5 minute, 3 minute songs and banging them out. And I did that for several years. And I was good enough to know that I wasn't good enough to make it a career. So I went back to school and did something else. But what I wanted to say about Solarpunk and these movements, literary, schools of thought and things like that, is that I've always had a problem with labeling things. And I find it can be useful in marketing terms, and also useful for academic criticism, but for writers and readers, I don't know how useful it really is. And I'll tell you the reason why is that I feel like when you label a writer a certain thing, that limits them. And then they feel like they can only be that one thing. And if they try to do something else, then they really can't do something else. And I know that I have edited a lot of anthologies that have these broad, themes. But one of the things that I try to do in the anthologies, I try to push the boundaries of what those literary views are. So when we did science fiction, you know, we pushed the boundaries of what science fiction is. Same thing with steampunk. I did 3 different steampunk anthologies. And if you take a look at the third one, in Steampunk Revolution, and compare it to what else was going on in steampunk, you'll see that that's always been one of the things that I try to do, is to push the boundaries, because I feel like when you label something, you're putting it into a box, and I'm not very good with that. I like to move those limits away so that the writers feel comfortable being able to write whatever it is that they want. Now, they might write a story that fits into a certain type of thing. It's a cyberpunk story, it's a steampunk story, it's a solarpunk story, or it's this. Or sometimes a writer might be writing a story not even thinking about those different literary conventions, and it's just, the story is what it is. And I feel like it's important for writers to write the story that's truest in their heart, and not think about those labels, and not think about, how am I going to market this and where am I going to put this? Labels can be useful later on in marketing when you walk into a bookstore and you go into a certain section. But when a writer is writing it, I think that the labels can actually be harmful, because it will limit them in their thinking. I can always tell when a writer sends me a story if they wrote something to fit into a narrow niche, what's trending right now, or if they're writing a story that's coming from their heart. I can tell the difference. So I want to make sure that writers are able to do what they need to do with their work. And now I have never heard, and I could be wrong about this, what Stan said about writers glomming on to these different schools of thought or these different literary traditions in order to find a community to help their work. I don't really know if they think about that intentionally, or if it just kinds of happens because they're gathering together with people that are also reading and writing the types of things that they like. And I think it's more organic than it is intentional, that they're thinking they need to do this in order to advance their careers. Most of the writers I know are not that well organized.
Indeed, it's like that. Indeed, it's like that. It's just because it's a reaction, the Solarpunk movement, or call it as you want, is a reaction to the Anthropocene and Capitalocene we are seeing. It's exactly the consequences of years and years of this kind of behavior. So it is not a strategy. They are looking for a strategy to the real problem, and the real problem is out there. So I think trying to put in fiction what is the problem outside of the fiction. So that's the kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to open the question from the audience, and because we have really a lot, and we'll probably have 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to address each question to one of you so that we can answer more of them. So the first one, I would like to address it to Stan, is, can science fiction still propose solution to help with climate change, even now that we reach the Anthropocene? Can you give some examples?
Sure. I think science fiction, as I've said earlier, is a modeling exercise where you run a scenario with a thick texture. And so solutions to climate change are new stories and new stories are rare on the ground. And science fiction is in position to tell those stories of things being tried and going right, maybe going wrong, as a warning against. The solar radiation management, you get a movie like Snowpiercer where people have gone too far and turned the planet into an ice ball. This isn't physically possible, but it does suggest the dangers of messing with the global environment. In the novel of mine that's coming out next month, I describe the effort to slow down the glaciers in Antarctica and Greenland by sucking the water from under them that is causing them to move faster. So this is a kind of an attempt to deal with the bad effects of climate change, and it's uncertain whether it's possible or not, but it was suggested to me by glaciologists. The examples could be continued infinitely. So I'll leave it at that and just say science fiction is the right tool for that particular narrative exploration.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next question is for Anne. How do you tackle fake news? We are in an era of science distortions, of political usage of lies. How do science fiction can help with this sort of post-reality created by conservative governments?
Oh gosh, well, I don't know if if me personally can attack and deal with fake news. I have certain writers, nonfiction writers who I trust, and I read their work. Ed Young, who writes for The Atlantic, is one of my favorite science writers, and I read him religiously. And as far as how to deal with fake news, on an individual level, you can just talk to people and have contacts with people one-to-one. As far as things that are being posted on Facebook or Twitter, that's larger than I as a single person can deal with. I can only be true to the things that I do. And when things get really, really depressing and bad, I post pictures of my cat, because everybody loves to see pictures of my cat and no one's going to argue that it's fake news. So that's how I deal with it. And I don't know if that was a very scientific answer, but there you go.
Okay, thank you. Ian, does the science fiction preoccupation with technoscience, which has been so tied to capitalism, hamper our ability to imagine positive alternatives to the Capitalocene?
No. Next question.
Oh.
No.
Okay. I move to the...
Yeah, basically the saying that we're kind of also obsessed with, with the next iPhone or a possible self-driving car, that we can't imagine an alternative to it. To go back to the Anthropocene, I think it's been around with this for a long time, since at least agriculture started, probably. Since we started kind of basically annihilating megafauna and creating climate change, which then appears in the rocks. The geology of the Sahara kind of changed after the Romans kind of grazed it down to the bedrock. So it's been around for so long time, and I think it will be around with us for a long time. The Anthropocene doesn't suddenly end whenever we get global warming under control, because if global warming is under control, it's because we've done it. It's a human process. It's something we have done either by changing our energy use, by absorbing carbon, by using various tech fixes, probably a combination of all of them. But the Anthropocene is kind of here to stay for quite a long time. It's about it's kind of about what we do with it. And it kind of goes back to what I was thinking about yet again about long-term thinking, that it's the hardest thing for people to do, but it is all out there. If anyone has children, you are investing in that future. You are, you are pushing them hopefully into a world you want to be better for them as well. And whether you have your self-driving car, whether you have your new shiny iPhone, that really kind of doesn't really matter, as long as they have a job, as long as they have security, as long as they have family, friends. Those are the important things. We can't put the tech genie back in the bottle again. It's kind of daft to imagine that. A lot of the arguments of the dark greeners and the whole kind of movement for voluntary human extinction is kind of very much kind of Western self-loathing writ very large. I think that there's kind of a sea change coming on, that humans are kind of, we're expanding ourselves. We're kind of moving into our technology, our memory, and our kind of reach. Our reach is expanding through our technology. And if we can use that to connect to each other, to make new connections, to establish new networks beyond just the echo chambers of our own opinions of people who are like us, then we have something very interesting that could happen, and the possibility of kind of real alternatives. But it's like Anne was saying, it's think global but act local is ultimately what it always comes down to.
Okay, thank you. So the next question for Stan: How do you think the climate problem connects to other major social environmental issues like inequality, racism, biodiversity loss, and nitrogen cycle imbalance?
They're all interconnected and part of a bigger macro problem. And the panel, you bring up this term capitalocene. And so this is, I think, the result of nearly 8 billion humans living by way of the capitalist system of extracting profit beyond what the biosphere can provide. And that comes from other people as well. So you get inequality. I think it's interesting that the Anthropocene is basically a science fictional term, because what it's postulating is if you go 25 million years into the future and you look back at the Earth, some alien or some post-humans look back, they'll be able to see in the Earth's geological record the marker of humanity's presence, which, as Ian suggested, could be agriculture, it could be the atomic bomb set off. There's all kinds of markers of the Anthropocene and they add up, but plastics will be one. To a very clear geological marker, but you have to do the mental exercise of jumping forward 25 million years and looking back. That's a science fictional exercise. Now, the capitalocene, which people have proposed as an alternative to this, that's saying, well, 8 billion people could live on Earth without these damaging effects. And so it's really capitalism that done it, not just human beings making this geological mark and destroying things. Well, that's alternative history. We have no idea if there's any alternative social order that could have avoided making these marks in the geological record. Strikes me as unlikely. So that when you, again, you've got another kind of science fictional exercise when you talk about the capitalocene. This is an alternative history view that it's not really us. And if we reorganized our social system, we might have a lesser impact. Well, this is a good thought. It's a worthy thought. And by bundling all the problems together that this questioner asked about into one macro problem, then you do get things that you could do locally and in your own life, but the global becomes crucial because we're really talking about an international culture. And it's at that level that the whole thing's going to have to be addressed. And yet we're in a nation state system. So in that dilemma, I just always point to the Paris Agreement. I say that the Paris Agreement is a significant point in world history if we make it so. And it provides the mechanism by which we can get out of all these problems.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. For Anne, have you come across something in real life that you previously imagined in one of the stories you edited or wrote?
Oh, gosh.
It's a tricky one.
That's really quite interesting because most of the fiction that I find myself gravitating towards is on the darker end, a stranger, darker, scarier, more horrific end. And so hopefully I don't. Now I will say that there has been many times when I've read a story or a novel that sticks with me so long that I dream about it continually. And those are the types of stories that I do look for, the ones that I can't easily get rid of in my head. Oftentimes when I'm reading fiction and determining whether or not to acquire it, I'll read it the first time and I go, gee whiz, golly, this is a fantastic story. And then 10 minutes later, it's gone. It's like cotton candy. And so that's why I like to mull it over in my head and read a story a couple of times and not necessarily take that first instance of, that lustful feeling when you first read a story and you think it's so wonderful. And then later on it disappears, or you think about it and you're like, that really doesn't make sense. And so for me, a story that sticks in my head and a novel that sticks in my head that I keep coming back to, that is what really floats my boat.
All right. So for Ian, what's the most convincing near future positive science fiction book that you've read recently? If you can, I don't know.
I read very, very little science fiction. The last I'm currently reading Susanna Clarke's Piranesi, which is wonderful, but it ain't near fiction. It ain't near future science fiction. The problem is that I tend not to. It's kind of what I'm writing at the moment. But it's kind of what I write in general. Well, that's. I tend to stay fairly close to Earth. I think the Mars and Desolation Road is about as far as I've got away, and the Moon a bit. But I kind of like to write about futures I can kind of reach, that I can see how to get there from here. So I don't tend to read what other people are writing about it, because either I'll be furious about it, or I will be jealous and I will steal it outright. So I tend to veer away and do my own thing. Now, the thing is, as we all know, kind of science fiction kind of exists by kind of zeitgeist resonances. Things happen, people write the same books at the same time, that without communicating at all. There is something in the atmosphere, there is something in the culture that we kind of write about. So I haven't actually read much at the moment. The one great near future science fiction book, and it was not at all a positive one. In fact, there were 4 of them, and it's back to the 60s and early 70s, was John Brunner's Stand on Zanzibar, Shockwave Rider, what was it about the weapons? The Jagged Orbit and The Sheep Look Up.
The Jagged Orbit.
Yeah.
The Jagged Orbit and The Sheep Look Up.
Yep, that's it. Yep, thank you. Yeah, fantastic books. And after that, he basically never needed to write again, and he knew it. And those have kind of been at the back of my thinking on kind of near future science fiction. So I'm not reading much else around them at the moment. The last complete speculative fiction book I read was a new Mike Harrison one, which yet again is about something totally Mike Harrison and therefore totally wonderful. So I am kind of avoiding it deliberately.
Okay. Don't worry.
I want to plow my own narrow groove.
All right. I might take the last one for Stan. These wildfires across the world, Australia, Brazil, the US, give us the sense of irreversible damage to the planet. How can we navigate the powers that allow such destruction in fiction and practice?
I'll get to that, but I want to briefly say I'm with Ian in that it's very hard to read one's contemporaries because it might impinge on your own imagination or scare you or intimidate you. So I also shy away, but occasionally I'll dip in, and I want to say that Ian's Dervish House is one of the great novels I've read in the near future for the last I don't even know, a decade or two. A very beautiful novel, and Ian is a maestro and one of the great artists of our time. Now, as for wildfires, they're natural, although they're also anthropogenic. One of the markers of
he went away. I just oops, sorry. Hopefully we will get him back. Yeah,
Australia down.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Okay, you're back.
Good. I saw where I dropped out, and I hope Ian got to hear my love of his writing, which I've
yet again.
But humans can start fires on purpose. And have the ones that are happening now are a part of a natural cycle. They burn an awful lot of carbon, but not as much as we do in our fossil fuel economy. So they are not the big problem. They are bad. My home state of California is burning right now. It's been bad, but these are not the big problem of our time. They're not even signals. In climate change, there'll be more of them, but there'll be even worse effects of climate change than wildfires per se. So just throw it into the pile of bad things that will happen as a result of climate change.
All right. Thank you.
Oh,
So
can I
we're-
add
oh,
one thing? Can I add
Of
one
course,
thing?
of course.
I want to also thank Anne VanderMeer for all of her editing, but in particular, the publication of the short novel Longer by Michael Blumlein,
Yes.
a dear friend of
Thank you.
mine. And the novel appeared in the last months of his life and made him immensely happy. And so I recommend that novella and thank Anne for that beautiful action.
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning him. May his memory
Okay.
be a blessing.
Indeed.
Can you repeat the name and the book, so we will write it
Yes.
It's a novella. It's called Longer by Michael Blumlein. Longer,
Okay.
Longer.
Okay, Michael. All right. So I think the time is almost over. So I would like to just ask each of you something about your current projects. What you can reveal. I know Stan has have a novel out soon, right? The Ministry of the Future. And so, what can you tell us?
The Ministry for the Future is a science fiction novel set in the very near future, in which a group founded by the Paris Agreement goes out there and tries to advocate for the generations to come by operations legal and in many ways illegal. So I tried to avoid the problem of writing eat your greens fiction, which Ian never does, but I often do. By throwing in everything in the kitchen sink. And so it's a kind of a summa. And now I'm off to writing about the Sierra Nevada, the mountains that I walk in California. I'm going to do a nonfiction book about mountain walking. And that is a great pleasure to get to that.
Nice. Anne?
Well, I just had my latest book just came out a couple of months ago, The Big Book of Modern Fantasy, and it was another ginormous, book. And I'm kind of taking it easy after that because I need a break. And what I've been doing, I've been reading to my grandkids in the different time zones. And the book I am reading to them right now is this book.
Oh.
Okay. Because I think it's important to read books from other countries. And so they're learning about Finland. Somewhat, yes, with the movements. But I also have some great original fiction coming up on tour.com. So look out for that, stories this year and also next.
Thank you. Ian?
Yeah, I should have delivered a novel by now, but an entire research trip got blown out of the water by the pandemic. So the whole thing's kind of on hold at the moment. But it's a novel that's kind of I've come back to Earth again into the very near future. Well, partly near future. It starts basically the day after Amy Winehouse dies and ends on the 25th of August, 2981. So, but it's got everything in it. Everything.
Cool. Looking forward to that. So I think we will close here, and I would like to remind to all the viewers of the FutureCon that we're going to have another panel on Future Africa, and it's going to be in 1 hour and a half. So if you want to join, please do, and on YouTube channel. And please remember that FutureCon doesn't end today, but we will continue to have a discussion, a conversation on our Discord server. So thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I had a great time. I hope you also had a good time. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see
Bye-bye.
you.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you. That was great.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.
Bye. Bless you. Yeah.
Did you have a
Let's
good
know.
time?
Let's do email. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Really great. Really, really.